Hi, is this an okay time? It's your girl Dylan Mulvaney, and I am inviting you to my weekly cocktail party and my brand new podcast, The Dylan Hour, brought to you by Lemonada Media. Life is stressful, and there is so much darkness in the world. I think we could all use a little bit of trans joy. So join me every week as I interview some of my favorite A-list celebrity friends and gurus, and of course, the dolls, while we sip and spill the scalding hot tea. So put your worries aside and join me at the Dylan Hour. You can listen on Apple, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. Love ya.
Hey everybody, it's Hoda Kotb, and I would love for you to join me for new episodes of my podcast, Making Space. Each week I'm having conversations with authors, actors, speakers, and dear friends of mine, folks who are seeking the truth, compassion, and self-discovery. I promise you will leave these talks stronger and inspired to make space in your own life for growth and change. To start listening, just search Making Space wherever you get your podcasts and follow for new episodes every Wednesday.
Lemonada. Hello and welcome to Good Things. I'm your host, Gloria Riviera. Over the years, it's become more and more expensive to rent. In fact, unaffordable rent recently hit an all-time high. Half of all renters are rent-burdened, and more than a quarter are spending upwards of 50% of their paycheck on housing. Scenarios in which people are trying to decide, do I pay my rent this month or do I feed my family, happen all the time. But higher rent prices don't necessarily reflect housing quality. In some places, rents continue to rise as conditions get worse. Our guest today, Tara Raghavir, pours all her energy into fighting against our dysfunctional housing market and the people in housing who abuse power. Tara is the director of KC Tenants in Kansas City, which organizes to ensure that everyone in Kansas City has a safe, accessible, and truly affordable home. Tara, welcome to Good Things. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
Before we get into the work that you do, the wins that you've worked so hard to achieve, I really want to hear about the emotional space or place that so many tenants are coming from internally. You've touched on these ideas of shame before and what our culture teaches us about striving for home ownership.
Yeah, most of the tenants that I encounter when we're knocking on doors or calling people, the tenants who show up to our meetings, are carrying some really deep shame. And that shame comes both from these kind of big concepts of who they think they should be or who society has told them they should be, what they should have aspired to, and how far their life is from that aspiration. You should be a homeowner. You should have aspired to own something, property, a home. You should be able to pay all your bills every month. And instead, here you are, a renter, you're a tenant, you're living in these horrible conditions. And then I think even interpersonally and in their day-to-day lives, I encounter so many people, and maybe especially parents, who carry really deep shame about the conditions that their families are subjected to and the realities of what it looks like to have to make choices between paying the rent in a given month or putting food on the table, and how trapped they feel in that experience. So there's some deep anxiety that sort of couples with the shame. People in this economy are working multiple jobs and still barely able to make ends meet, right? People are working into late life beyond a point where their body is able to actually do work. And all of this creates a sort of unending, relentless anxiety that you can literally see on people's bodies, right? The way they carry their bodies kind of shows us that. But I will say, too, I think there's something really beautiful that we encounter, especially as people get politicized and they get angry and they feel permission to feel that anger. We start to see that anger. And then we also start to see people's pride and indignation once they realize that these conditions are actually not their fault, but the fault of a system that has commodified what should be treated as a basic human right.
Yeah, in my mind, just as you said, we also see something else. I felt like you were referencing a nexus point at which the shame and the anxiety and the way you talk about being able to see it in a person's body changes when they start to realize, wait a minute, what are my rights? What are my rights as a tenant? What led you to this kind of organizing? When did you start to really care about housing issues and question what kind of power tenants have?
For me, this is just one arena where we can see power dynamics play out. We see it all the time at the workplace, in schools, in government. There's people who have power, there's people who don't have power. And I think I've always been curious about the dynamics between those parties, and especially what it looks like for those who systematically and otherwise don't have power to organize collectively and fight back and try to win a power that wasn't actually granted to them from the start. So for me, I started as a researcher. I was working on evictions and trying to understand how evictions impacted my hometown, Kansas City. This is now over 10 years ago. And through the research, honestly, I was just politicized. Researchers are supposed to approach these types of projects with a degree of neutrality. And I found that impossible. I was talking to people who were telling me these stories that just didn't make sense. I remember drawing little diagrams in my notebook being wait, Chuck and Ivy have done everything right. They have all these benefits. They're old. They can't pay the rent, but the rent is too damn high. And they'll get evicted if they can't pay the rent. Evictions are happening because people can't pay the rent, but people can't pay the rent because the rents keep right. I was drawing these diagrams, kind of driving myself mad at how this system doesn't make sense. It actually just doesn't make sense. And so through this research, I was politicized and feel really lucky to have then encountered the art and science and this beautiful craft of organizing. And I've gotten to spend the last decade plus of my life honing my craft and developing a sort of new practice of organizing with the people that I get to work with now.
I love that you touch on the idea of evictions and this image of you trying to draw out, right? Trying to make sense of it on paper when there is no sense to be made, right? And that's propels you to the next step. Let's just take that and do some table setting for people who may not know about this type of organizing. And we'll start very simply. What is a tenant union?
A tenant union is a group of tenants who get together under a very simple premise. There's strength in numbers. And fundamentally, there's more of us than there are them. Us, in this instance, meaning the tenants, and them, meaning the landlords or the people who control our home or control the capital that controls our home. The premise of a tenant union is very similar to that of a labor union. Again, it's about the strength of numbers and not just the numbers themselves, but actually wielding the power of the collective, wielding the leverage that we have as tenants. Landlords these days love describing themselves as housing providers. It's this kind of beautiful way that they've decided to rebrand what is really a money-making enterprise off of a basic human right. What we would argue is that tenants are actually the providers of this housing because it's our rent that pays the landlord's mortgage, that allows them to own the property. So a tenant union is about channeling the power of the collective. And one of the ways that we can do that is through the union and through union activities like rent strikes, right? We can actually withhold our rent as a way of intervening in that power dynamic that feels so fixed and feels so impossible, but actually has a lot to do with just how organized the tenants are.
Right. Do you encounter people who find the idea of withholding rent, oh, I can do that? Are there moments where you have to sort of harness as many as you can, instill that power, the idea of that kind of power into them, and then see it multiply by several degrees?
Absolutely. And here's some additional table setting that's relevant here is that the rent is unaffordable in every single pocket of this country, whether we're talking urban, suburban, rural. No one can pay the rent. The rent is too damn high. There's no county in this country where a person working full-time, earning minimum wage, can afford a 2-bedroom apartment. So people can't pay the rent. And often withholding rent or not paying the rent feels like an act of desperation. I can't pay the rent, so I'm forced to make a choice this month. If I want to feed my kids, I have to feed my kids. I just can't pay the rent. I'm going to be behind. And that often feels like an act of desperation. The difference between that and a rent strike is the difference between an act of desperation and an act of collective power. So, of course, people's understanding of what it means to not pay the rent is powerless, right? People's only experience of that is powerless. But once people get introduced the idea that we could actually do it together, neighbors could actually endeavor this major risk together, it doesn't eliminate people's fear, right? And they have every right to be fearful. There is massive risk involved in this, and it shouldn't be taken lightly at all. But people start coming around to this idea because fundamentally, people know what they deserve. And they know that if they're paying money for something, they better be getting what they deserve in return. And for way, way too many tenants in this country, that is not actually how it works. So when you introduce this idea that there's actually something we could do about it, and we don't start with a rent strike. We start with all sorts of other activities, demands, escalations. The rent strike is the end of a very long journey for a union. It's not taken lightly. It's approached with an abundance of discipline. But once we get there, and the only way we get there is by people deciding, you know what, this risk is worth it with my neighbors and with a lot of consideration because I deserve something better than what I'm getting today.
So tell me, we're going to keep it simple. Why is rent so expensive?
Rent is so expensive because we are basically held hostage by a conspiracy of the profiteers. Housing has been completely commodified in this country. And what I mean by that is that we treat it as an investment, as a money-making vehicle for some. Tenants then become line items in their landlord's budgets. And we've just accepted this as normal. This isn't actually normal, and this isn't even how it has always been in this country, even within the last 100 years, right? But in the last 50 or so years, it's become more and more the case that the government's role in supporting and ensuring that people are housed has been eradicated, and the role of the private market has ballooned. And this, of course, serves the profiteers, right? The architects of that market are deeply interested in making sure that the private market's role grows and that they have basically no checks on their ability to continue making money. So the rent is too damn high because this is a completely unregulated market. It is like the Wild West out there, right? So often I'll encounter tenants, and sometimes even the middle-class parents of young tenants who are renting for the first time, whose kid has suddenly faced a 200% rent increase, right? And the parent, who maybe has been an owner for decades, will ask me, this can't be legal, right? You can't just raise the rent willy-nilly, like nothing's changed about the apartment. And unfortunately, in most places in this country, that's completely legal because we're talking about a sector that's vastly unregulated. The price of rent is not based on the quality or condition of the home. The price of rent is based on whatever the market will allow. And the market is the product of these profiteers. And it's a money-making enterprise for them. So that's part of the reason the rent is so damn high. And another part of the reason is that the federal government has not only abdicated their responsibility, but also actually enabled this practice, right? There's massive amounts of financing that flows from the federal government to the private sector every year with very little strings attached, and certainly no regulations on what they can do about the price of rent.
We're going to take a quick break, but we will be right back with more on Good Things.
It's true that some things change as we get older. But if you're a woman over 40 and you're dealing with insomnia, brain fog, moodiness, and weight gain, you don't have to accept it as just another part of aging. And with MIDI Health, you can get help and stop pushing through it alone. The experts at MIDI understand that all these symptoms can be connected to the hormonal changes that happen around menopause, and MIDI can help you feel more like yourself again. Many healthcare providers aren't trained to treat or even recognize menopause symptoms. MIDI clinicians are menopause experts. They're dedicated to providing safe, effective, FDA-approved solutions for dozens of hormonal symptoms, not just hot flashes. Most importantly, they're covered by insurance. 91% of MIDI patients get relief from symptoms within just 2 months. You deserve to feel great. Book your virtual visit today at joinmidi.com. That's joinmidi.com.
This is an ad by BetterHelp. Let's talk numbers. Traditional in-person therapy can cost anywhere from $100 to $250 per session, and that adds up fast. But with BetterHelp Online Therapy, you can save up to 50% more per session and pay a flat fee for weekly sessions, making therapy more affordable and easier to fit into your life. Therapy should feel accessible, not like a luxury. BetterHelp connects you with licensed professionals who can help with everything from anxiety to everyday stress at a price that makes sense. Your mental health is worth it, and now it's within reach. Whether you're facing big life changes or just need support, therapy provides the tools to navigate it all. With over 30,000 therapists and 5 million people served globally, BetterHelp is the world's largest online therapy platform. It's convenient, flexible, and you can switch therapists anytime. Your well-being is worth it. Visit BetterHelp.com today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com.
When you started Casey Tenants, what did it look like in the very beginning?
We were founded in February of 2019. And we started with 12 people. The next week we had like 35. The week after we had 55. 3 days later, we launched on the steps of City Hall with 120 people in negative 10-degree weather. And then we were off to the races. And this is both a story of good, scrappy organizing. It's also a story of like hunger within the community for something like this. Like, it didn't take that much, actually, to knock on a door, pick up the phone and invite someone to a meeting for people to be like, yeah, I'm coming. And then once they were in the meeting and people were telling stories and the whole crowd was responding and saying, that ain't right. That ain't right. No way. All they needed was an invitation into a group that was aligned with what they understood to be the truth of their own experience and was actually validating them in what they suspected, which is like, this isn't my fault and this isn't right, and there has to be something different and better than this. So the early days of Casey Tenants were beautiful. They were chaotic. They were a mess. I feel like I got an education in organizing as I was doing it through the Casey Tenants leaders. Even though I had been an organizer before, there's nothing like actually being in it with a group of people and trying to build something with them. So we tried stuff that worked. We tried stuff that didn't work. We were scrappy. We were ferocious. We were in the streets. We were shutting down town halls. That spring, there were municipal elections, and we sort of forced housing to the center. It had not been a key issue in Kansas City politics at all. People had kind of lazily assumed that Kansas City is an affordable place, even though it has not been for poor people. And then ultimately, the person who was elected mayor, he's currently still our mayor, Mayor Quentin Lucas, he had really championed housing. And one of the first things we asked him to do when he was mayor was spend his first night in one of the worst properties in Kansas City. The biggest evictor in Kansas City at that time was an out-of-town corporation called TEH Realty. And they owned this horrible property called Green Village Townhomes. And we had a leader named Nicole who was living there with her sons. And Quentin Lucas agreed. And he he spent that first night in Nicole's home. And as you can imagine, that was a huge tone shift, vibe shift. Like, just everything changed that year as we started organizing. And that was one of many inflection points. And happily, I can report to you that 6 years later, we've just continued building from there, right? I think one thing I love about our leaders is that they are not satisfied with being marginal, and they're not satisfied resting on our laurels as many wonderful things as we've gone on to achieve.
One of the other people that you started it with was a woman named Tiana Caldwell. What is her story?
Tiana's amazing. A point of personal pride for me as an organizer is that all of our co-founders are all still deeply involved in the union. And the union is a product of their brilliance and their soul and their experiences. So I feel really proud about that. Tiana and I had met in November or December of 2018. And we had met at the end of a year where she had received her second cancer diagnosis, and she had subsequently been evicted twice. And when we met, she and her husband, Derek, and their son, AJ, were living in a hotel paying $500 a week because being poor is expensive as hell. And she couldn't take it anymore. And she basically looked at me and said, what are we going to do about this? And it was from that question that we started building Casey Tenants. And she was one of the first tenant leaders who very publicly forced this issue into our city's politics. She held up signs at the public library in forums filled with 600 people that said, I'm homeless. What are you going to do for me? Right? She spoke at our first rallies. And it was actually through her that I understood that many of the people who were coming to our meetings and our actions had not only not ever spoken at events like that before, they had never attended them before. Tiana is like inherently deeply a political person, but she had never seen herself at any protest before this. And this was her invitation. This was sort of the place that she had been waiting to go. And since that time, she has been a Black organizing fellow with Casey Tenants. She came on staff with Casey Tenants. She's now back on the board of Casey Tenants. She's been part of building every aspect of what our union is and all of the amazing wins that we've had since then. And she's now just one of over 10,000 leaders like her in Kansas City who have had a role in building our union.
Wow, gosh, 10,000. So from a dozen at the first meeting to now.
Over 10,000 members.
I'd love to know about evictions. What happens when it comes to eviction?
So the laws are different state by state, so I can't speak to the entire country. Broadly, one thing to understand is that there aren't eviction protections at the national level that do much of anything for tenants in states like mine in Missouri. So then we're left to state law. And in many states in this country, including mine, the law is stacked against the tenant. So landlords can pretty swiftly take a tenant to eviction court and within a matter of a couple of weeks have them out of the place and fundamentally scar their rental record, right? Once you have an eviction on your record, it becomes that much more difficult to rent again. An important piece of nuance here, though, is that not all landlords take their tenants to eviction court. There's a lot of informal evictions that happen in brutal ways and in ways that feel really mundane, but are also brutal, right? I've seen landlords shut off appliances, shut off utilities, threaten tenants. A lot of tenants, they just receive a threatening letter and they take that as an eviction notice. So they sort of relinquish even the day in court and they just leave. And frankly, they do that because they know that the odds are stacked against them in court. So they'd rather just get out before they end up with a court record. The other thing I will say is that it's not typically understood this way, but I would argue that a rent increase is also tantamount to an eviction in today's economy. If your rent is increased 50%, 70%, whatever it is, you can't just swallow that cost next month. What choice do you have, right? So you're effectively forcibly displaced just like you would be during an eviction. So these are some of the ways that eviction plays out in this day and age. And how that shapes the rental market is also important, right? I said tenants who end up with an eviction on their record are then scarred in the rental market, and their options are then even more limited than they already were before. And that's how you see tenants ending up with what I like to call landlords of last resort. Like sometimes when we describe the conditions of some of these buildings to people who have never lived in them, they're like, well, why would you live there? Like, get out. Those are horrible conditions. Just move somewhere else. The trouble is, if your options are limited to begin with because you're a poor person or a working class person, and then maybe you have an eviction on your record, you actually have no place to go. And so when you enter the leasing office, you're entering, again, from a place of desperation. And that desperation, by the way, is like sniffable by the leasing agents, right? And whole business models are designed around that desperation. Leases are written based on that desperation. Landlords are very aware that in this economy, the tenant is trapped. They actually have nowhere to go, especially poor tenants, especially Black and brown tenants have nowhere to go. And therefore, certain landlords, not all of them, certain landlords know they can get away with anything. And they do.
Yeah, I mean, the phrase that just came to my mind was they can get away with murder, which is like...
They are getting away with murder. I think just to be explicit about it is super important, right? Life expectancy is lower in these types of conditions. Like it's death by 1,000 cuts, but it's death nonetheless, right? I see people all the time suffering from illnesses caused by mold, caused by rodents, caused by stress and distress and financial instability. They are getting away with murder.
Can we just touch on the shared power that tenants have?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we see this all the time, not just in Kansas City, but in a bunch of the unions that we work with across the country. There's something intrinsically powerful about knowing our neighbors, especially in a world that keeps us hustling and keeps us separate and tells us to keep our heads down. There is a sort of relational power in breaking down those divides. And we see that all the time. And this sounds fluffy, but it's really not, and increasingly not in a world that looks as divided as this one does. We have Black people in our base, white people in our base, people of all different colors in our base, all different ages. I think the age range is like 5 to 82, a range of sexualities, backgrounds, even political orientation, which surprises people. But it's like, we do not have a litmus test at the door when people enter the tenant union to ask like who they voted for in last November's election. That to us completely defeats the point, right? As long as you come in with some shared interest with the other people in that room and are willing to go on a sort of journey together with them as your comrades within the union, we're cool, right? So that's like one aspect of the power. Another is like within the context of a building, when unions are organized, then they're able to get really creative about how to leverage their power. We're all going to sign a demand letter. We're all going to take this kind of action or that kind of action up to the point of rent strike, right? At which we've executed a few of. And then in our citywide union, the other thing that's been really remarkable, because we organize people across a bunch of different apartments and in every pocket of the city, and people who are unhoused and people who are homeowners as well, we've built a ton of political power. KC Tenants is now this sort of defining voice in Kansas City's politics. And it's powerful, actually. On election days, we often see people walking to the polls basically voting on the KC Tenants ticket. Even when we don't have people running, people are looking to the tenant union to sort of direct their politics.
Okay, sit tight, everyone. We're going to take one more quick break, and we'll be right back with more good things.
Hi, I'm Megan, and I've got a new podcast I think you're going to love. It's called Confessions of a Female Founder, a show where I chat with female entrepreneurs and friends about the sleepless nights, the lessons learned, and the laser focus that got them to where they are today. And through it all, I'm building a business of my own and getting all sorts of practical advice along the way that I'm so excited to share with you. Confessions of a Female Founder premieres April 8th. Listen wherever you get your podcasts.
Hi, I'm Emily Deschanel.
And I'm Carla Gallo, and we're here to bring you
Boneheads, the official Bones Rewatch podcast.
That's right. We're watching all the episodes of Bones, starting with episode 1, and we are the right people to do it.
I played Dr. Temperance Brennan, and I met Carla 16 years ago on set.
I played Daisy Wick.
Tune in every Wednesday to hear all our behind-the-scenes stories, conversations with cast and crew, and our favorite moments.
Boneheads from Lemonada Media is out wherever you get your podcasts.
Tell me a little bit about the rent strike at Quality Hill Towers and Independence Towers. They started last October. What were the events that led to those rent strikes? Because earlier you said, listen, this is not nowhere close to where we start, and we take it very seriously. Yeah. So what got you there?
Quality Hill Towers is in downtown Kansas City. It's almost 300 units in these really tall towers that you can see from like our city hall. And it is a building that is mostly filled with either young people who are renting for the first time, people who are workers in the service industry, or older people on fixed incomes. And it's a lot of people for whom there are very, very few, if any, other options in Kansas City. Quality Hill Towers looks great online. Not anymore, because their reviews have tanked since the strikes launched. But, you know, a lot of the tenants that we would speak to said, I came here because I saw that there was a pool, right? I saw that there were amenities that looked good, et cetera. Turns out the pool had then been closed for years. The amenities were basically a sham. A lot of these units were filled with horrific conditions issues, again, that were sort of making people sick. So we wanted to get well over 50% of the tenants in the building signed on to a union and test out that kind of leverage in a building of this size. And we did that, and we built towards strike authorization, and we took that building on strike on October 1st of last year. And they were on strike for several months until they de-escalated from the strike in December. And along the way, they won a ton of improvements. They won tens of thousands of dollars of forgiven rent. They sort of activated the entire city behind them. We had these beautiful actions there almost every Friday during the strike. And now, Gloria, like the reality is a bunch of tenants who were on strike, especially the leaders of the union's efforts, are in eviction court. But even in eviction court was our nightmare, right? We were like, this is the scariest potential outcome. Even in eviction court, the union is offering them protections. Because they unionized, we're able to settle a lot of these cases outside of court and get so much rent forgiven and cut deals for these tenants that otherwise would have been left paying full rent for months on end for these conditions that they never should have been forced to endure. So that's Quality Hill Towers. Independence Towers, we started organizing there last spring. So it's a little bit newer to us, but the conditions are super, super bad. And what I mean by that is like there's whole floors of this building that are burned out. Like there's been fires and the remnants of those fires are still there. They're not being cleaned up. They lost hot water like 6 times as we started organizing there in the spring. It's been under horrible ownership. This local slumlord named Parker Webb had owned that building, and then finally the government had to take it from him. So now it's been under receivership. At the end of July, a child fell from a broken window to his death, right? So we're talking like horrific and, as we discussed, deadly conditions in these buildings. We took that building on strike in October. They're still on strike. They're 6 months into what is now the longest rent strike in regional history. The last thing to say about these two buildings is that the reason they were chosen specifically is that both of them share financing. Both of these properties were financed by Fannie Mae, which is a government-sponsored bank. and their landlords were getting sweet loans with very limited terms attached to finance these properties, and within these properties treating tenants this badly. So this is the first coordinated rent strike in history to actually target not only the landlords, but also the federal lender, and call the question on why public money is being used to finance these types of conditions for our neighbors. So the rent strike is just ongoing at this point, and the main demand is that the tenant union wants a seat at the table if and when a new buyer enters the mix, because the building is for sale. It's, as you can imagine, not a super attractive asset for anyone to buy at this point, both because of the condition of the building, but also because of the organization of the tenants. The tenants are not paying rent. So when you're an investor thinking about making a purchase, you're probably not likely to buy this building. So this remains our source of leverage. We're basically saying to the federal bank that's financed the loan and the temporary receiver, you're probably not going to be able to sell this building, definitely not for good terms, if the tenant union isn't involved in selecting a new owner and negotiating a collectively bargained lease with them.
Right. I want to talk about some of the wins that KC Tenants has had because they are substantial. There is the $50 million bond for housing that the union secured. I'd love for you to explain that to me. Also, the union was able to defeat this $2 billion sales tax. Can you briefly touch on each of those? Let's start with the $50 million bond for housing.
Yeah, absolutely. So there was a ballot question a few years back about a $50 million bond for affordable housing. And KC Tenants looked at that and we said, that sounds good. But how are we defining affordable? Because the way that the city actually understands affordable is not at all affordable to our people. Our city defines affordable as $1,200 or $1,300 for a one bedroom. If you said that to a poor person in Kansas City, they would spit coffee in your face. That's not affordable. So we said, we can get behind this bond if we define affordable in a way that actually makes sense for poor and working class people in Kansas City. So we wrote a resolution, we got it passed through our city council that said that all of this $50 million, if passed, would go to truly affordable housing, which we defined as under 30% of area median income. So deeply affordable housing. And we passed that bond by a pretty wide margin. I will say, basically none of that money has been spent yet. Like no units of housing have been built through that money. And a lot of the reason for that, Gloria, is that it actually doesn't make financial sense for a private developer to build truly affordable housing. And I'm not blaming them, but it's like their business model requires them to build housing at a rate that's not affordable to people. Their business model actually isn't organized around providing housing to people. It's about making them money, right? So we would argue that there actually needs to be a much bigger role for the public sector as a developer, or at least as the provider of kind of big subsidies for truly affordable development. Otherwise, it's just not going to happen. So that's a little bit about the bond, but it was a beautiful campaign. We had people on the doors throughout the city. The rallying cry was 50 milli for the people, and we won by a lot because the union put a bunch of muscle behind the campaign. Sort of flip side of that story is the stadium campaign, which was just last year. This time last year, the Royals, our baseball team, and the Chiefs, our football team, decided to put a sales tax on the ballot that asked the people of Jackson County, Missouri, which includes Kansas City, to pay $2 billion over 40 years, that's billion with a B, $2 billion over 40 years to fund a new downtown stadium and improvements to the Chiefs Stadium. And basically, our people said, F a downtown stadium. That's not what we need. That's not what we need to put $2 billion of our dollars into in the next 40 years. There's probably 15 other priorities that we would rather fund before that. And more to the point, a sales tax is regressive. That costs poor and working class people in Kansas City more than it costs rich people in Kansas City, or a greater share of their income. So we said no to a regressive tax, no to a downtown stadium, no to a displacement of people from their homes and also small businesses from their buildings in our downtown. We were the only organized opposition to the sales tax. Everyone else, and this is a kind of core piece of KC Tenant's lore and a lot of how we think about everything. Every other person and institution in Kansas City said, this is inevitable. It's the Chiefs and the Royals. If they want something, they're going to get it. Everyone else said, this is inevitable. Let's just beg for whatever crumbs we can get from a community benefits agreement. And our people said, nothing is inevitable, not if we organize. And even if this might be inevitable, it is our responsibility to call the question on what it means to live in a city where billionaires get to just do whatever the hell they want at whatever cost to the rest of us. Who is this city for? So our people said, let's actually just call that question. And we might lose by a lot, but it's a question that we have to call. And we called the question, and we don't take that lightly, right? When we take a position like that, we commit ourselves to it. So we organized like our lives depend on it, because they do. And we knocked doors, and we held forums on tax policy in both English and Spanish. We did public actions. We politicized the city and the rest of the county. We sent mail. We had a TV ad. We were outspent. They spent more money on this election than any election in our region's history. We had like $100,000 to spend on it. They spent multiple millions. And in the end, we won by like 16 points. We smoked them. We smoked them.
Wow.
And again, what that said to us is that none of this stuff is inevitable, not if we organize. And also, the people of Kansas City, the people of Jackson County are with us. And they actually care about public resources being spent in the public interest. And they care about the same things that we care about. And that's an amazingly hopeful and buoying thing to learn, especially in times like these, and especially in a part of the country that is often written off as like conservative and backwards and stupid. You know, we were organizing with libertarians and cops' wives and all sorts of people who don't actually share a lot of our ideology, maybe, but we were organizing around shared interests, and we won by a lot. And we challenged every element of the political establishment and came out of it feeling 1,000 feet tall.
What kind of conversations do you have with people about what their rights are? What do tenants deserve for what they are paying for?
Tenants deserve safety, security, peace of mind, the freedom to make choices. Tenants deserve not to have to make decisions between getting their prescriptions or paying the rent, feeding their kids or paying the rent, paying their car bill or paying the rent, and more, right? I think that's part of the beauty that I'm exposed to every day is like our people have bigger dreams than just survival. On the tenant meeting on Saturday, one of our leaders said, my biggest dream at this moment in time is a revolution and a garden.
Oh my gosh. I love that. That's the perfect note to end on. Thank you so much for the work that you do, and thank you for this conversation.
Thanks, Gloria. Take care.
This episode is presented by the Marguerite Casey Foundation. Learn more at caseygrants.org. Thanks for listening to Good Things. I'm your host, Gloria Riviera. This series is produced by Hannah Boomershine, Lisa Fu, and Aria Bracci. Our supervising producer is Muna Danish. Mixing and sound design by Noah Smith. Jackie Danziger is our VP of Partnerships and Production. Production support from Maggie Kraushaw. Executive producers are Stephanie Whittles-Wax and Jessica Cordova Kramer. Help others find our show by leaving us a rating and writing a review. Follow Good Things wherever you get your podcasts and listen ad-free on Amazon Music with your Prime membership. Thanks so much for listening. We'll see you next week.
Want more from your favorite Lemonada Media podcasts while supporting the shows that help make life suck less? Subscribe to Lemonada Premium today. As a subscriber, you'll unlock exclusive bonus content like never-before-heard interviews, behind-the-scenes moments, bonus episodes, and so much more. It's easy to sign up no matter what podcast app you use. On Apple, you can just click the Lemonada logo in the Apple Podcast app and hit subscribe. For all other podcast apps, head to lemonada.supportingcast.fm to subscribe. That's lemonada.supportingcast.fm.
Are you looking for ways to make your everyday life happier, healthier, more productive, and more creative? I'm Gretchen Rubin, the #1 best-selling author of The Happiness Project, bringing you fresh insights and practical solutions in the Happier with Gretchen Rubin podcast. My co-host and happiness guinea pig is my sister, Elizabeth Kraft.
That's me, Elizabeth Kraft, a TV writer and producer in Hollywood. Join us as we explore ideas and hacks about cultivating happiness and good habits.
Check out Happier with Gretchen Rubin from Lemonada Media.